Hi there and welcome to Tilt Astrology. As always, just a reminder that I'm a sidereal astrologer, not a Western astrologer. So today we're going to look at Donald Trump's chart, and this video is just basically just going to be this chart with no other graphics. And we're going to be touching on the topics that we'll all be interested in, which is where is all the money coming from and why is he so lucky? Throughout this video, you're going to hear me refer to terms from both Vedic and Hellenistic astrology. So after many years, I've just kind of taken what seems to work the best from both of these schools rather than sticking to one exclusively. So you're going to hear me referring to terms like karakas and dashas, which is from Vedic astrology, but also Egyptian bounds, also called Egyptian terms, from Hellenistic astrology. So let's look at the big three, which is the ascendant, the sun, and the moon. So first off, using sidereal, he's got a Leo first house with Mars right up against the ascendant. And right in the middle there is also Regulus, the royal star. This is the most fortunate star in all of the fixed stars, and Regulus is about nobility, leadership, power, and status. It's right on top of the ascendant at 5 degrees, and it's within 3 degrees of Mars. Leo is ruled by the sun, which is in the 10th house, and it's extremely strong here according to Vedic, and it's pretty good from a Hellenistic point of view as well. Sun is the karaka, which is the equivalent of planetary joy in Hellenistic astrology for the first house. Leo is a fixed fire sign. Basically, Mars is in pretty good shape here, and whatever happens, Mars is going to stick with it. So in Vedic astrology, Mars is considered to act like a general to the sun. So, whatever the sun wants, Mars is going to try and go get it for the sun. This Mars makes Trump a fighter in this setup. However, Rhetorius, an astrologer who lived during the late 6th or potentially early 7th century, notes that those born with Mars in the hour marker, which is the ascendant, can be hot-headed, reckless, daring, and foolhardy. So there's also a sextile aspect between the sun and Mars. So there's a real connection between these two houses. And, as I said, the first house is extremely strong and the 10th is extremely strong, as these are angle houses, also called Kendra houses in Vedic. So Mars is also the karaka for the 3rd and 6th houses. So the 3rd is effort and desires and adventures, amongst other things. And the 6th is, apart from health and illness, it's also the ability to overcome enemies. So straight out of the gate, Trump's chart has a Mars that's just basically prepared to kick butt. And also Mars can just be very auspicious for a Leo ascendant, according to Vedic astrology. So Mars is also an Egyptian term or bound for Jupiter. This gives Mars even more qualities that are to do with leadership, including being active and well-known. Although it also says this Mars has no mean traits, but this is more than offset by the moon, which we'll go into shortly. On the downside, Mars is in the 1st house, which is associated with what's called Mars affliction or Kuja dosha in Vedic. So this affects marriages and generally predicts divorce. Kuja dosha predicts marital discord, delays in marriage, spouse having health problems. In the 1st house, Mars can make the person dominating and aggressive in the marriage. And the advice in Vedic astrology is to find someone that also has this in their chart, and then it kind of cancels each other's out. So moving to the sun, which rules the 1st house, and remember Mars is going to try and do whatever the sun wants. So in both Vedic and Hellenistic, the 10th house is the strongest house, apart from one. It's an angular house, which we've talked about, a Kendra house in Vedic. in Vedic, the sun is extremely strong, and it pretty much is okay here. Although I should say Vedic reviews the sun as a kind of malefic, because the sun can overpower the chart. So it can, it's like the real sun. It can burn things up because it's too hot, or freeze the chart because it's too cold. So the sun is in Taurus, ruled by Venus, and right beside the North Node, which is also called Rahu in Vedic. So Venus's influence on the sun is kind of weak anyway, as it's barely moved into the 12th house. And in fact, if you check in the astronomy program that I have, which is Stellarium, it's still in Gemini. So Taurus is a fixed earth sign. And of course, Taurus is the sign associated with possessions, estates, and luxuries. The sun represents power, ambition, ego, authority, rulership, the government, and professional status and popularity, amongst other things. So Venus doesn't have much to do here in the way of a beneficial effect. It's not sweet and lovely. It's not got much to offer, except maybe a bit of a 12th house vibe. But that's all overruled by the North Node being so close to the sun. So the sun is sitting in the term of Mars, which gives the sun an additional characteristic of being tyrannical, fiery, harsh, destructive, what they call a Vetus Valens, who is an astrologer from the 2nd century. He calls it a looter of temples. So that is a looter of religious buildings and institutions, and generally it's regarded as quite destructive. And the North Node, also called Rahu in Vedic, represents insatiable cravings and a desire for worldly success. So it's power hungry and never satisfied. So being in the 10th house, it craves fame and recognition, and this position helps it fulfill its ambitions. So the North Node sits in the Egyptian term of Saturn, which gives the North Node a quality of being a bit gloomy, a vagabond, meaning it's a bit of a grifter type thing, theatrical and toilsome, so basically a bit of a downer when attending a party, but a bit of flair when in front of the camera. So for the craving for fame and recognition is extremely high, and the sun has more than enough energy along with Mars to pull this off. So his ascendant pretty much sums it all up. It's a craving for worldly power and luxury, and being willing to kind of do whatever it takes to get that. So there's also a lot of self-esteem and confidence to burn. So the moon is where things get slightly largely problematic. So the moon in Vedic represents your emotional quality, so the quality of your mind. So this isn't your intellect, that's Mercury. So this is more about your happiness, your emotions, or how happy you're going to be over your lifetime. So the moon is in Scorpio, ruled by Mars, and it's right beside the South Node, which is also called Ketu in Vedic, and opposite the Sun, within 1 degree. So it's a waxing gibbous moon, very close to being a full moon. In fact, it's a full moon at around 1:45 in the afternoon. So this makes for a mind that is not exactly happy. So in Western astrology, this type of opposition brings in stress between wants and needs. Vedic judges this by the brightness of the moon. So Vedic considers the brighter the moon, the better the emotional makeup of the mind. But then there's a point where they're also going, well, wait, maybe not that bright. So the South Node tends to be an indicator of enlightenment and spirituality when it's placed ideally and conjunct no other planets. It prefers the signs of Pisces and Sagittarius, which are both the signs associated with Jupiter, because those are also considered to be a spiritual guru in Vedic. Now the South Node can overwhelm whatever planets it's conjunct with, And in this case, it's a terrible sign for both the South Node and the Moon. Scorpio being ruled by Mars makes this about an extremely destructive combination. It's also in a fixed sign, a water sign. So it's stubborn here, but with the South Node, this introduces a kind of wavering quality to things. So the moon is in its own house, the fourth house, a house which shows happiness and contentment and the mother and fixed assets, such as land, buildings and real estate, comfort and luxuries, amongst other things. The South Node here gives that person the desire to never stop. So there's just this endless wanting without ceasing. And even if he gets what he wants, he's not going to be happy. Mars makes him domineering with a desire for revenge. And both the South Node and the Moon are in the Egyptian term of Saturn, which is described by Vetis Valens as a hater of its own relatives, melancholic, a misogynist, having secret wounds, being very punitive, and cursing fate. And Vetis Valens also notes that this Egyptian term causes a person to be hated by gods and men, that the person resists their superiors and is despised by their inferiors. So what do we have here? We have a setup of a person who is determined, no matter what happens, has an out-of-control need for fame, wealth, power, and recognition, and will do whatever it takes to get it done, basically. He hasn't got a lot of love for people. Potentially he's not even that in love with his own family. And he's unsuited to marriage unless he has a partner prepared to give as good as they get. So now we're going to pivot to prosperity and finances, because this is the other thing we're obviously interested in, along with luck. So Jupiter is in Virgo in the second house and is stationary. So the second house is about your own resources and is an indicator of wealth. Unfortunately, Jupiter is no fan of Mercury, so it's in detriment here because this is Virgo ruled by Mercury. It has got a trine up to the Sun, so again, it's got that connection between this Sun that wants a lot of wealth, so that does well for that sign. Both Virgo and Gemini are double-bodied sign, also called mutable signs. So double-bodied signs can show areas subject to enormous amounts of change in a particular area. So Jupiter's going to try and do its best here, but wealth has a tendency to evaporate, but then the wealth comes back. So it's kind of like a yin-yang sign. The money comes in, the money goes out. This isn't like it's in detriment where it all kind of is permanently problematic. It's stationary, so it kind of, the money rolling in and money rolling out is a lifelong effect. So as I've already said, the house is associated with wealth, but it's also the resources that you can gather and hold yourself. So again, property and possessions are part of those resources, and also your finances, so your bank account and things like that. Jupiter is in the Egyptian term of Mars, which is not so great because it gives this Jupiter a harsher vibe. So it can indicate a public figure, but it can also indicate counterfeiters, imposters, and demagogues. So the thing that ties this Jupiter together and probably does a better job of explaining where this money is coming from is the 11th house. So the 11th house is a house that brings in large sums of money, seemingly out of nowhere. This is where we talk about the luck aspect. The 11th house is the house of unexpected gains, opportunities, as I've already talked about, large sums of money, as well as groups you're associated with and friendships. So the 11th house in Hellenistic astrology is considered to be the third best house after the angular houses of 1 and 10. In Vedic, the 11th house is considered to be a growing house, so it improves over time. And both malefic and benefic planets do quite well in the 11th house, depending on the sign the planets are placed in. So this is a house of opportunity, and planets in the house, depending on their state, will always bring repeat opportunities to that person. So it also shows a person with massive desires as well as this third house. So the Karaka of this house is Jupiter, and the Karaka of the second house is also Jupiter. If we look at the 11th house, we can see it's Gemini. So as I've already talked about, another double-bodied sign. Again, subject to fluctuations, but Mercury is in its own sign here, so it's in very good condition. And it's also ruling the second house because, as we've talked about, Mercury rules Virgo. So note here that Mercury shows the intellect of the person, so how smart they are or how good they are at a particular skill. So Trump, from an emotional perspective, represented by the moon, tends to have a vindictive, kind of wavering quality, but his Mercury is really great. So yes, he is probably a very smart person when it comes to ensuring he always has money or tries to get the upper hand in a deal. But it's kind of tripped up by this moon. But yeah, he does have that quality. And remember, the 11th house is the house of luck. So that Mercury is doing a lot to offset any problems or bad luck that comes his way. So Mercury is an Egyptian term of Venus, which makes this Mercury a contest winner, popular and cheerful and prolific. So it really blossoms here. So Mercury is a business person here, a person interested in trading with other people, as Mercury sits in the 11th house. Saturn is in its own Egyptian term of Saturn, and this gives it a quality of being intellectual, having wide knowledge, and again, famous, and an arranger of very important matters. So I briefly mentioned, so astronomically, Mercury, Saturn, and Venus are all still in Gemini, and these planets are friends with each other. So no one's fighting with each other. If I see planets close to a boundary of another sign, I tend to check stellium for their actual locations. And then I judge them as either still acting weakly in their current house, but also having some spillover into the next house. So these kind of got a foot in each camp, so to speak. So Saturn can't do much here as it's kind of at the end of the sign. By the way, this is also a signifier of real estate, but it's also, because it's Saturn, it's about restriction, delays, and burdens, but it also represents authority and leadership. And as we've talked about, it's close to wandering into the 12th house, which is traditionally associated with debt and expenses and losses. So Saturn's pretty comfortable, however, in the 12th house, as it's the Karaka for the 12th house. But then the 12th house sign is Cancer, and that's ruled by the moon, and Saturn is an enemy of the moon, although the moon is neutral to Saturn. So Vedic astrologers caution against judging Saturn in the 12th house, as it's not going to bring definitive results here, but again can be associated with unexpected debts and expenses. But it's generally weak, so meaning those debts and losses can probably be overcome, especially with that fierce quality of the moon ruling Cancer on the 12th house, along with Mercury being in its own sign on the 11th. Venus, which represents women and the love life, amongst other things, is doing the same thing. It's kind of weak in the 12th house, has the same effect, still has a little bit of effect on the 11th house. By the way, in Vedic astrology, the 12th house represents what is termed bed pleasures, which is a reference to sex. The 12th is also about prisons and hospitals. So in a specific case of Venus, this appears to be showing misfortune and loss associated with that particular desire. However, the weakness of Venus and the fact that it's in a sign ruled by that really fierce moon means that in the end, I don't think any real consequences are ever suffered. So It's interesting to note here that as the 11th house also rules groups of people, for example, clubs you might join, and friendships, this may also show that Trump surrounds himself with all sorts of different people, although the condition of Saturn and Venus implies they probably don't give good advice. So we have a Mercury, representative of trade and commerce, in its own sign, bringing in unexpected gains and income, but in an unpredictable manner due to Gemini being a double-bodied sign. Mercury is neutral, but it tends to take on the characteristics of whatever planet it's with. So in this case, it's also got a slight influence from Saturn and probably a little bit of influence from Venus. So these houses put together create this interesting tension of a person who's set up to be wealthy one moment and then not wealthy the next. The trick, though, is that money always lands in his court. So he's never going to be broke, but he's never going to be as rich as he wishes he could be. Interestingly, the second house in Vedic also reflects your speech, which does show some issues with Jupiter being ruled by Mercury. Again, a smart person with a big, grandiose way of talking, but that might not always reflect the reality on the ground. So I'm just going to cover some additional notes that I think are quite interesting from a Vedic perspective. So the Vedic system uses Dasha periods, which are a method of timing for the life of a person. So it's a system that fits into the same mold as annual perfections, solar returns, secondary progressions, Videria, zodiacal releasing, transits. These are all timing techniques, so trying to predict when something might happen. So in Vedic, there is a Dasha period, which is called the Saturn Dasha period. And the Saturn Dasha period is usually long and considered to be one of the hardest periods for a person to live through, as Saturn can be immensely demanding and introduce long delays depending on what sign it's in. So even if it's in its own sign, it can produce limited effects depending on the house placement. So most people experience a Saturn Dasha at some point in their lives, but it's the timing of when that occurs that can have the most effect. So for example, if you go through a Saturn Dasha period in your 30s, it can potentially bring progress in your life, including career and your love life, to an abrupt halt. So the interesting thing is Trump does not experience his Saturn Dasha until he's into his late 80s. So there has never been a period in his life, according to Vedic, where he's faced any actual real delays. So he's always been in forward motion and he's been able to recover from whatever life has thrown at him. He's been running a Jupiter Dasha period since 2017, and that's going to last until 2033 using Fagan Allen. Jupiter isn't his most powerful planet, but it's up there. And also, according to Vedic astrology, the last 2 years of the Dasha period typically introduce a bit of stress as it moves from one area of life to another. So, even if nothing else happened, here we get to 2031 and start to see the effects of that Saturn Dasha play out. He has several good yogas that are permanent, including a Dharma yoga, which is lifelong. So this is active and brings in wealth. He also has a yoga karaka for Mars, which is significant and brings success, prosperity, and achievements. And as we've talked about, Mars is conjunct his ascendant. So yoga is a combination of planets that produce a particular effect. So in conclusion, what can we say about Donald Trump's chart? He's a person that is fiercely determined. He will not bend on the whole no matter what. He wants power and wealth and status, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it. So that's the core of who he is. He'll take revenge on someone he perceives as an enemy, with the complicated setup of the moon in Scorpio conjunct the south node, opposite the sun in Taurus, conjunct the north node. This is a guy who just fights even if he seems he could lose, and he figures out a way to get out of it no matter what. So he'll just do what he needs to do to win. However, as with all humans, luck can't hold out forever. In this Dasha period, he hits a Venus bhukti, which is essentially a sub-period of time from March of 2025 until March of 2027. How this turns out could be interesting as it activates good yoga in his chart, but Venus may not be in the condition to really do much with it. So Venus is kind of okay here, but it brings in the ruler of the sign, which is that frazzled, unhappy moon we talked about. There's also a Pratyana Dasha of Saturn that occurs at December 2026 through to May 2027. So that's going to be a Jupiter-Venus-Saturn period, which may not be as lucky for him. Venus and Saturn, as we've talked about, are in weaker condition and seem to influence loss and debt in his chart. So as we talked about, though, he generally gets out of it. His solar return, however, from June 2026, which this is here, as always, it's got like a strong Jupiter, it's got strong Mars, but he's got a new moon, which is pretty much invisible on the chart because it's conjunct the sun. And the ascendant is in Capricorn, indicating that he's going to be forced to work very hard for very little gain because Saturn comes into play in the third house. So Vedic has the third house as representing willpower and, of course, desires. So he's going to work very hard trying to get those desires, but he probably isn't going to be that successful, and it's going to bring in trouble with various relatives. The South Node is in the 8th house, crossing over or very close to his ascendant. So this can be problematic. This can really indicate financial misfortune. And the transits, if you move them forward, appear to be rough around December of 2026 through to March 2027. And that lines up with the mundane chart that I did. So, we'll have to see how this plays out. So that's it from me. Thanks for watching this far. Feel free to like and subscribe. And I hope to see you again for my next video.